5.1 Understanding how and why we listen. Learning objectives. Describe the stages of the listening process. Discuss the four main types of listening. Compare and contrast the four main listening styles. Listening is the learned process of receiving, interpreting, recalling, evaluating, and responding to verbal and nonverbal messages. We begin to engage with the listening process long before we engage in any recognizable verbal or nonverbal communication. It is only after listening for months as infants that we begin to consciously practice our own forms of expression. In this section, we will learn more about each stage of the listening process, the main types of listening, and the main listening styles. Heading: The listening process. Listening is a process and, as such, doesn't have a defined start and finish. Like the communication process, listening has cognitive, behavioral, and relational elements and doesn't unfold in a linear, step by step fashion. Models of processes are informative in that they help us visualize specific components, but keep in mind they do not capture the speed, overlapping nature, or overall complexity of the actual process in action. The stages of the listening process are receiving, interpreting, recalling, evaluating, and responding. Heading: Receiving. Before we can engage the other steps in the listening process, we must take in a stimuli through our senses. In any given communication encounter, it is likely that we will return to the receiving stage many times as we process incoming feedback and new messages. This part of the listening process is more physiological than other parts, which include cognitive and relational elements. We primarily take in information needed for listening through auditory and visual channels. Although we don't often think about visual cues or a part of listening, they do influence how we interpret messages. For example, seeing a person's face when we hear their voice allows us to take in nonverbal cues from facial expressions and eye contact. The fact that these visual cues are missing in email, text, and phone interactions presents some difficulties for reading contextual clues into meaning received through only auditory channels. Our chapter on perception discusses some of the ways in which incoming stimuli are filtered. These perceptual filters also play a role in listening. Some stimuli never make it in. Some are filtered into subconsciousness, and others are filtered into various levels of consciousness based on their salience. Recall that salience is the degree to which something attracts our attention in a particular context, and that we tend to find salient things that are visually or audibly stimulating and things that meet our needs or interests. Think about how it's much easier to listen to a lecture on a subject that you find very interesting. It is important to consider noise as a factor that influences how we receive messages. Some noise interferes primarily with hearing, which is the physical process of receiving stimuli through internal and external components of the ears and eyes. And some interferes with listening, which is the cognitive process of processing the stimuli taken in during hearing. While hearing leads to listening, they are not the same thing. Environmental noise, such as other people talking, the sounds of traffic, and music, interfere with the physiological aspects of hearing. Psychological noise, like stress and anger, interfere primarily with the cognitive processes of listening. We can enhance our ability to receive and, in turn, listen by trying to minimize noise. Heading: Interpreting. During the interpreting stage of listening, we combine the visual and auditory information we receive and try to make meaning out of that information using schemata. The interpreting stage engages cognitive and relational processing as we take in informational, contextual, and relational cues and try to connect them in meaningful ways to previous experiences. It is through the interpreting stage that we may begin to understand the stimuli we have received. When we understand something, we are able to attach meaning by connecting information to previous experiences. Through the process of comparing new information with old information, we may also update or revise particular schemata if we find the new information relevant and credible. If we have difficulty interpreting information, meaning we don't have previous experience or information in our existing schemata to make sense of it, then it is difficult to transfer the information into our long-term memory for later recall. In situations where understanding the information we receive isn't important or isn't a goal, this stage may be fairly short or even skipped. After all, we can move something to our long-term memory by repetition and then later recall it without ever having understood it. I remember earning perfect scores on exams in an anatomy class in college because I was able to memorize and recall, for example, all the organs in the digestive system. In fact, I might still be able to do that now over a decade later, but neither then or now could I tell you the significance or function of those organs, meaning I didn't really get to a level of understanding, but simply stored the information for later recall. Heading: Recall. Our ability to recall information is dependent on some of the physiological limits of our memory, of how memory works. Overall, our memories are known to be fallible. Here, we forget about half of what we hear immediately after hearing it, recall 35% after 8 hours, and recall 20% after a day. Our memory consists of multiple storage units, including sensory storage, short-term memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Our sensory storage is very large in terms of capacity, but limited in terms of length of storage. We can hold large amounts of unsorted visual information for, about a tenth of a second. By comparison, we can hold large amounts of unsorted auditory information for longer, up to 4 seconds. This initial memory storage unit doesn't provide much use for our study of communication, as these large but quickly expiring chunks of sensory data are primarily used in reactionary and instinctual ways. As stimuli are organized and interpreted, we make their way to short-term memory, where they either expire or are forgotten or transferred to long-term memory. Short-term memory is a mental storage capability that can retain stimuli for 20 seconds to 1 minute. Long-term memory is a mental storage capability of which stimuli in short-term memory can be transferred if they are connected to existing schema, and in which information can be stored indefinitely. Working memory is a temporarily accessed memory storage space that is activated during times of high cognitive demand. When using working memory, we can temporarily store information and process it and use it at the same time. This is different from our typical memory function in that information usually has to make it to long-term memory before we can call it back up to apply a current situation. People with good working memories are able to keep recent information in mind and process it and apply it to other incoming information. This can be very useful during high stress situations. A person in control of a command center like the White House Situation Room should have a pretty good working memory in order to take in, organize, evaluate, and then immediately use new information instead of having to wait for that information to make it to long-term memory and then be retrieved and used. Although recall is an important part of the listening process, there isn't a direct correlation between being good at recalling information and being a good listener. Some people have excellent memories and recall abilities and can tell you a very accurate story from many years earlier during a situation in which they should actually be listening and not showing off their recall abilities. Recall is an important part of the listening process because it is most often used to assess listening abilities and effectiveness. Many quizzes and tests in school are based on recall and often are used to assess how well students comprehended information presented in class, which is seen as an indication of how well they listened. When recall is our only goal, we excel at it. Experiments have found that people can memorize and later recall a set of faces and names with near 100% recall when sitting in a quiet lab and asked to do so. But throw in external noise, more visual stimuli, and multiple contextual influences, and we can't remember the name of the person we were just introduced to 1 minute earlier. Even in interpersonal encounters, we rely on recall to test whether or not someone was listening. Imagine that Azam is taking, or rather talking to his friend Bell, who is sitting across from him in a restaurant booth. Azam, annoyed that Bell keeps checking her phone, stops and asks, "Are you listening?" Bell inevitably replies, "Yes," since we rarely fess up to our poor listening habits. And Azam replies, "Well, what did I say?" Heading: Evaluating. When we evaluate something, we make judgments about its credibility, completeness, and worth. In terms of credibility, we try to determine the degree to which we believe a speaker's statements are correct and true. In terms of completeness, we try to read between the lines and evaluate the message in relation to what we know about the topic or situation being discussed. We evaluate the worth of a message by making a value judgment about whether we think the message is a good idea or a bad idea, right, wrong, or desirable, undesirable. All these aspects of evaluating require critical thinking skills, which we aren't born with but must develop over time through our own personal and intellectual development. Studying communication is a great way to build your critical thinking skills because you learn much more about the taken for granted aspects of how communication works, which gives you tools to analyze and critique messages, senders, and contexts. Critical thinking and listening skills also help you take a more proactive role in the communication process, rather than being a passive receiver of messages that may not be credible, complete, or worthwhile. One danger within the evaluation stage of listening is to focus your evaluation lenses more on the speaker than the message. This can quickly become a barrier to effective listening if we begin to prejudge a speaker based on his or her identity or characteristics rather than on the content of his or her message. We will learn more about how to avoid slipping into a person centered rather than message centered evaluative stance later in the chapter. Heading: Responding. Responding entails sending verbal and nonverbal messages that indicate attentiveness and understanding or a lack thereof. From our earlier discussion of a communication model, you may be able to connect this part of the listening process to feedback. Later, we will learn more specifics about how to encode and decode the verbal and nonverbal cues sent during the responding stage. But we all know from experience some signs that indicate whether a person is paying attention and understanding a message or not. We send verbal and nonverbal feedback while another person is talking and after they are done. Back channel cues are the verbal and nonverbal signals we send while someone is talking and can consist of verbal cues like uh-huh, oh, and right, and or nonverbal cues like direct eye contact, head nods, and leaning forward. Back channel cues are generally a form of positive feedback that indicates others are actively listening. People also send cues intentionally and unintentionally that indicate they aren't listening. If another person is looking away, fidgeting, texting, or turned away, we will likely interpret those responses negatively. Paraphrasing is a responding behavior that can also show that you understand what was communicated. When you paraphrase information, you rephrase the message into your own words. For example, you might say the following to start off a paraphrased response: "What I heard you say was," or "It seems like you're saying." You can also ask clarifying questions to get more information. It is often a good idea to paraphrase with a question to keep a conversation flowing. For example, you might pose the following paraphrase and question pair: "It seems like you believe you were treated unfairly. Is that right?" Or you might ask a standalone question like, "What did your boss do that made you think he was playing favorites?" Make sure to paraphrase and or ask questions once a person's turn is over, because interrupting can also be interpreted as a sign of not listening. Paraphrasing is also a good tool to use in communicated, or rather computer mediated communication, especially since miscommunication can occur due to a lack of nonverbal and other contextual cues. Heading: The importance of listening. Understanding how listening works provides the foundation we need to explore why we listen, including various types and styles of listening. In general, listening helps us achieve all the communication goals physical, instrumental, relational, and identity that we learned about in the chapter titled Introduction to Communication Studies. Listening is also important in academic, professional, and personal contexts. In terms of academics, poor listening skills were shown to contribute significantly to failure in a person's first year of college. In general, students with high scores for listening ability have greater academic achievement. Interpersonal communication skills, including listening, are also highly sought after by potential employers, consistently ranking in the top 10 in national surveys. That's according to the National Association of Colleges and Employers in 2010. Poor listening skills, lack of conciseness, and inability to give constructive feedback have been identified as potential communication challenges in professional contexts. Even though listening education is lacking in our society, research has shown that introductory communication courses provide important skills necessary for functioning in entry-level jobs, including listening, writing, motivating, persuading, interpersonal skills, informational interviewing, and small group problem solving. Training and improvements in listening will continue to pay off as employers desire employees with good communication skills, and employees who have good listening skills are often more likely to get promoted. Listening also has implications for our personal lives and relationships. We shouldn't underestimate the power of listening to make someone else feel better and to open our perceptual field to new sources of information. Empathetic listening can help us expand our self and social awareness by learning from other people's experiences and by helping us take on different perspectives. Emotional support in the form of empathetic listening and validation during times of conflict can help relational partners manage common stressors of relationships that may otherwise lead a partnership to deteriorate. The following list reviews some of the main functions of listening that are relevant in multiple contexts. The main purposes of listening are to focus on messages sent by other people or noises coming from our surroundings, to better our understanding of other people's communication, to critically evaluate other people's messages, to monitor nonverbal signals, to indicate that we are interested or paying attention, to empathize with others and show we care for them, relational maintenance, and to engage in negotiation, dialogue, and other exchanges that result in shared understanding of or agreement on an issue. Heading: Listening types. Listening serves many purposes, and different situations require different types of listening. The type of listening we engage in affects our communication and how others respond to us. For example, when we listen to empathize with others, our communication will likely be supportive and open, which will then lead the other person to feel heard and supported, and hopefully view the interaction positively. The main types of listening we will discuss are discriminative, informational, critical, and empathetic. Heading: Discriminative listening. Discriminative listening is a focused and usually instrumental type of listening that is primarily physiological and occurs mostly at the receiving stage of the listening process. Here, we engage in listening to scan and monitor our surroundings in order to isolate particular auditory or visual stimuli. For example, we may focus our listening on a dark part of the yard while walking the dog at night to determine if the noise we just heard presents us with any danger. Or we may look for a particular nonverbal cue to let us know our conversational partner received our message. In the absence of a hearing impairment, we have an innate and physiological ability to engage in discriminative listening. Although this is the most basic form of listening, it provides the foundation on which our more intentional listening skills are built. This type of listening can be refined and honed. Think of how musicians, singers, and mechanics exercise specialized discriminative listening to isolate specific oral stimuli, and how actors, detectives, and sculptors discriminate visual cues that allow them to analyze, make meaning from, or recreate nuanced behavior. Heading: Informational listening. Informational listening entails listening with the goal of comprehending and retaining information. This type of listening is not evaluative and is common in teaching and learning contexts, ranging from a student listening to an informative speech to an out of town listener listening to directions to the nearest gas station. We also use informational listening when we listen to news reports, voicemail, and briefings at work. Since retention and recall are important components of informational listening, good concentration and memory skills are key. These also happen to be skills that many college students struggle with, at least in the first years of college, but will be expected to have mastered once they get into professional contexts. In many professional contexts, informational listening is important, especially when receiving instructions. I caution my students that they will be expected to process verbal instructions more frequently in their profession than they are in college. Now, most college professors provide detailed instructions and handouts with assignments so students can review them as needed. But many supervisors and managers will expect you to take the initiative to remember or record vital information. Additionally, many bosses are not as open to questions or requests to repeat themselves as professors are. Heading: Critical listening. Critical listening entails listening with a goal of analyzing or evaluating a message based on information presented verbally and information that can be inferred from context. A critical listener evaluates a message and accepts it, rejects it, or decides to withhold judgment and seek more information. As constant consumers of messages, we need to be able to assess the credibility of speakers and their messages and identify various persuasive appeals and faulty logic known as fallacies, which you can learn about in the chapter titled Informative and Persuasive Speaking. Critical listening is important during persuasive exchanges, but I recommend always employing some degree of critical listening because you may find yourself in a persuasive interaction and that you thought was informative. As is noted in Chapter 4, Nonverbal Communication, people often disguise inferences as facts. Critical listening skills are useful when listening to a persuasive speech in a class and when processing any of the persuasive media messages we receive daily. You can see judges employ critical listening with varying degrees of competence or on talent competition shows like RuPaul's Drag Race, America's Got Talent, and The Voice. While the exchanges between judge and contestant are those shows rather, is expected to be subjective and critical. Critical listening is also important when listening to speakers that have stated or implied objectivity, such as parents, teachers, political leaders, doctors, and religious leaders. We will learn more about how to improve your critical thinking skills later in this chapter. Empathetic listening is the most challenging form of listening and occurs when we try to understand or experience what a speaker is thinking or feeling. Empathetic listening is distinct from sympathetic listening. While the word empathy means to feel into or feel with another person, sympathy means to feel for someone. Sympathy is generally more self oriented and distant than empathy. Empathetic listening is other oriented and should be genuine. Because of our own centrality in our perceptual world, empathetic listening can be difficult. It's often much easier for us to tell our own story or to give advice than it is to really listen to and empathize with someone else. We should keep in mind that sometimes others just need to be heard, and our feedback isn't actually desired. Empathetic listening is key for dialogue and helps maintain interpersonal relationships. In order to reach dialogue, people must have a degree of open mindedness and a commitment to civility that allows them to be empathetic while still allowing them to believe in and advocate for their own position. An excellent example of critical and empathetic listening in action is the intentional or international truth and reconciliation movement. The most well known example of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission occurred in South Africa as a way to address the various conflicts that occurred during apartheid. The first TRC, as it's known, in the United States occurred in Greensboro, North Carolina, as a means of processing the events and aftermath of November 3rd, 1979, when members of the Ku Klux Klan shot and killed 5 members of the Communist Workers' Party during a daytime confrontation witnessed by news crews and many bystanders. The goal of such commissions is to allow people to tell their stories, share their perspectives in an open environment, and be listened to. The Greensboro TRC states its purpose as such. The Truth and Reconciliation process seeks to heal relations between opposing sides by uncovering all pertinent facts, distinguishing truth from lies, and allowing for acknowledgement, appropriate public mourning, forgiveness, and healing. The focus often is on giving victims, witnesses, and even perpetrators a chance to publicly tell their stories without fear of prosecution. Heading: Listening styles. Just as there are different types of listening, there are also different styles of listening. People have categorized many as one or more of the following listeners: people-oriented, action-oriented, content-oriented, and time-oriented listeners. Research finds that 40% of people have more than one preferred listening style, and that they choose a style based on the listening situation. Other research finds that people often still revert back to a single preferred style in times of emotional or cognitive stress, even if they know a different style of listening would be better. Following a brief overview of each listening style, we will explore some of their applications, strengths, and weaknesses. People-oriented listeners are concerned about the needs and feelings of others and may get distracted from a specific task or the content of a message in order to address feelings. Action-oriented listeners prefer well-organized, precise, and accurate information. They can become frustrated with their perceived communication to be unorganized or inconsistent, or a speaker to be long-winded. Content-oriented listeners are analytic and enjoy processing complex messages. They like in-depth information and like to learn about multiple sides of a topic or hear multiple perspectives on an issue. Their thoroughness can be difficult to manage if there are time constraints. Time-oriented listeners are concerned with completing tasks and achieving goals. They do not like information perceived as irrelevant and like to stick to a timeline. They may cut people off and make quick decisions, taking shortcuts or cutting corners when they think they have enough information. Heading: People-oriented listeners. People-oriented listeners are concerned about the emotional states of others and listen with the purpose of offering support in interpersonal relationships. People-oriented listeners can be characterized as supporters who are caring and understanding. These listeners are sought out because they are known as people who will lend an ear. They may or may not be valued for the advice they give, but all people often want is a good listener. This type of listening may be especially valuable in interpersonal communication involving emotional exchanges, as a people-oriented listener can create a space where people can make themselves vulnerable without fear of being cut off or judged. People-oriented listeners are likely skilled, empathetic listeners and may find success in supportive fields like counseling, social work, or nursing. Interestingly, such fields are typically feminized, in that people are often associated or associating the characteristics of people-oriented listeners with roles filled by women. We will learn more about how gender and listening intersect in Section 5, Listening and Gender. Heading: Action-oriented listeners. Action-oriented listeners focus on what action needs to take place in regards to a received message and try to formulate an organized way to initiate that action. These listeners are frustrated by disorganization because it detracts from the possibility of actually doing something. Action-oriented listeners can be thought of as builders, like an engineer, a construction site foreperson, or a skilled projection manager. This style of listening can be very effective when a task needs to be completed under time, budgetary, or other logistical constraints. One research study found that people prefer an action-oriented style of listening in instructional contexts. In other situations, such as interpersonal communication, action-oriented listeners may not actually be very interested in listening, instead taking a "what do you want me to do" approach. A friend and colleague of mine who exhibits some qualities of an action oriented listener once told me about an encounter she had with a close friend who had a stillborn baby. My friend said she immediately went into action mode. Although it was difficult for her to connect with her friend at an emotional, empathetic level, she was able to use her action oriented approach to help out in other ways as she helped make funeral arrangements, coordinated with other family and friends, and handled the details that accompanied this tragic emotional experience. As you can see from this example, the action oriented listening style often contrasts with the people oriented listening style. Heading: Content oriented listeners. Content oriented listeners like to listen to complex information and evaluate the content of a message, often from multiple perspectives, before drawing conclusions. These listeners can be thought of as learners, and they also ask questions to solicit more information to fill out their understanding of an issue. Content oriented listeners often enjoy high perceived credibility because of their thorough, balanced, and objective approach to engaging with information. Content oriented listeners are likely skilled, informational, and critical listeners and may find success in academic careers in the humanities, social sciences, or sciences. Ideally, judges and politicians would also possess these characteristics. Heading: Time oriented listeners. Time oriented listeners are more concerned about time limits and timelines than they are with the content or senders of a message. These listeners can be thought of as executives, and they tend to actually verbalize the time constraints under which they are operating. For example, a time oriented supervisor may say the following to an employee who has just entered his office and asked to talk: "Sure, I can talk, but I only have about 5 minutes." These listeners may also exhibit nonverbal cues that indicate time and or attention shortages, such as looking at a clock, avoiding eye contact, or nonverbally trying to close down an interaction. Time-oriented listeners are also more likely to interrupt others, which may make them seem insensitive to emotional personal needs. People often get action-oriented and time-oriented listeners confused. Action oriented listeners would be happy to get to a conclusion or decision quickly if they perceive that they are acting on well organized and accurate information. They would, however, not mind taking longer to reach a conclusion when dealing with a complex topic, and they would delay making a decision if the information presented to them didn't meet their standards of organization. Unlike time oriented listeners, action oriented listeners are not as likely to cut people off, especially if people are presenting relevant information, and are not as likely to take shortcuts.